And thank you all for coming today. So my name is Larry Kessler. I'm with the Boyd Center for Business and Economic Research. And today I'm pleased to release our annual economic report to the governor. So this is a report that we release every year. It provides a short-term economic outlook for the state economy looking 10 quarters ahead, as well as a more long-term economic projection looking 10 years ahead. So today I'll provide some brief remarks and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have. So the first thing we do in the report is look back at how the year has done from an economic standpoint. And obviously this year has been heavily defined by the COVID-19 pandemic. So the report in large is largely framed around the pandemic and its economic effects as well. So starting back in the spring, the labor market both in Tennessee and the nation were hit extremely hard by the pandemic, as everyone knows. In Tennessee, we lost nearly 400,000 jobs in a 1-month period between March and April, and the unemployment rate shot up to 15.5%. So since then, however, April does, from an economic standpoint, April does seem to be the low point, and we have seen positive economic growth in each month since. However, economic activity and employment levels, they're still well below pre-pandemic peak from January and February. So as a result, we're projecting for the year as a whole in 2020 that real GDP in Tennessee will contract by 3.5%. And that at the end of 2020, there will be 116,000 fewer workers on payrolls in Tennessee than there were at the end of 2019. But again, most of those losses, really all of those losses occurred in the first half of the year, mostly in the second quarter, and we have seen positive job growth since. Looking ahead in 2021, we do expect at the moment positive growth going forward as we continue to dig out of the recession. In 2021, we're calling for real GDP in Tennessee to increase by 2.9%. And then in 2022, we'll see even stronger growth of 3.6%. But our outlook suggests that Tennessee GDP will not fully recover to pre-pandemic levels until the end of 2022. Then looking at non-farm employment, we'll kind of see a very similar trajectory of positive growth going forward over the next couple of years as we continue to recover. But the first half of 2021, we'll see moderate growth as the virus continues to shape our recovery. And then we'll hopefully see stronger growth in the second half of the year as vaccines become more widely distributed throughout the state and the nation, and we kind of get back to pre-pandemic economic activity and spending levels. However, we're projecting that non-farm employment, it will not fully recover to pre-pandemic levels until the middle of 2023. And even then, some sectors are going to take longer to recover than others as there's going to be some scarring. So leisure and hospitality, for example, one of the hardest hit by the pandemic, won't recover until 2024. And our forecast has employment levels in the manufacturing sector staying below, not fully recovering even by 2030. And that's largely because manufacturers are going to continue to rely on labor-saving technologies such as automation and advanced manufacturing. So there are certainly a number of downside risks to both our forecast and economic growth going forward. The most obvious and the largest is the trajectory of the virus. So as caseloads continue to surge this winter and have been hitting all-time highs, we're seeing counties and states start to reimpose restrictions, and consumers, they can certainly grow more cautious again and start to reduce spending. And that could definitely lead to a second economic contraction as early as the first quarter of next year. However, I would say that we are, from an economic standpoint, we are in a better position now than we were in the spring. Consumers have largely figured out kind of how to navigate the pandemic and all of the restrictions. So they're making shopping trips today, but with a mask that they wouldn't have done in the spring. And businesses have largely adopted to new practices already to kind of account for this new reality. So they've beefed up their online ordering systems or delivery systems and so forth. So in those adaptations can certainly provide a buffer to a second economic shock. So finally, every year we also write a chapter on what we view as a prescient topic, and that's chapter 4 each year. And this year, of course, it's also on COVID, and we do a more deep dive into the economic effects of COVID-19 thus far. So it's a retrospective looking at the economic effects that have occurred thus far. The two largest sections in that chapter look at the labor market and state tax revenues. So as I mentioned earlier, the labor market was hit incredibly hard, especially in the spring from the pandemic. And one of the key metrics we look at is, especially now as kind of the pandemic has led to economic effects that move so rapidly, we've been looking at weekly unemployment insurance claims, and those have been in the news a ton over the course of this last year. So in Tennessee, since mid-March, there have been over 900,000 new UI claims from mid-March to mid-November, a period of about 36 weeks. And that vastly outpaces the number of UI claims for the entirety of the Great Recession, which lasted a full 81 weeks. So it's just an example of kind of how quickly and how bad the recession has been thus far. One of the few economic bright spots, however, has been state tax revenues. So unlike in previous recessions, sales tax revenues have done pretty well during this recession, and there's a number of reasons why. So first, the CARES Act and fiscal stimulus through the federal government providing enhanced UI benefits and stimulus checks, that's helped to prop up household income to some extent throughout some of this year. Second, there's been this huge shift in consumer spending patterns as consumers have started spending far less on services, especially those that require in-person contact, such as haircuts. And most of those in-person services are not taxable in the state. And they've shifted a lot of their spending to the goods market. So buying from like home improvement stores and sporting equipment stores, and those goods are taxable. So that's led to a boost in sales tax revenue as well. Finally, there's been two very timely legislative changes surrounding online sales tax collections on online purchases that have been incredibly important because they have boosted sales tax revenues in a time when online purchases have just become extremely popular during the pandemic. So in that chapter, we also provide a brief discussion on early stage business formation during the pandemic, the take-up or expansion and take-up of public assistance programs in Tennessee, as well as implications for education and learning through the pandemic, in particular through online education. So I encourage anyone, if you're interested in learning more about those topics, to read that chapter in full. Finally, the last thing I want to mention is that while all of the economic data are pointing to a recovery, the recovery thus far has been incredibly uneven. So there are a number of businesses, especially in the service sector, that are still struggling as the virus kind of still dictates how consumers spend their money. Employment levels among higher wage workers, especially those that can work from home, has largely recovered to levels that we saw prior to the pandemic, but employment levels among lower wage workers is still severely depressed. And we're seeing families still dealing with food insecurity and struggling day to day on to deal with their finances. So in November, there were over 10 million people still unemployed nationwide, and about 40% of those had been unemployed for at least 27 weeks, so at least half of the year, suggesting that many of them have likely already run through their savings and exhausted their UI benefits or are going to do so soon. So while most of the aggregate data are pointing to an economic recovery, there are still many services, or many businesses, many sectors, many families, and many individuals that are still struggling. And I think it's important as we talk about the economic data or as we read through the report that we keep that in mind. So with that, I will take any questions that anyone has.
This is Dave Fluster with the Chattanooga Times Free Press. Thanks for doing this very much. A couple quick questions. I was curious what the impact will be with unemployment, pandemic, unemployment insurance, and other things running out on the December 26th, depending on what Congress does. Short term, if some of the stimulus and unemployment benefits run out, or what the impact in Tennessee is particularly is going to be of that.
Yeah, I think we are in a pretty precarious position at the moment, especially with cases surging. So I think a couple weeks ago, I would have probably said that from an aggregate standpoint, we would be okay because consumers still, there's still a number of people working and a number of people spending money. They're just spending money on goods rather than services. But now I think as cases have just gotten even worse and worse, we're now kind of in this position where, well, our consumer is going to start to retreat again, like we saw in the spring. And as you mentioned, there's a ton of people that are going to run out of unemployment insurance benefits soon, and they're certainly going to struggle. It's just whether or not we see that in the aggregate data, it's still unclear. But I think even if the aggregate data points to kind of an improving economy, as I kind of mentioned at the end of my comments, there's still going to be a ton of people struggling, and that just might not be caught in the aggregate data for Tennessee as a whole.
I was curious as well, you said the hospitality industry wouldn't fully recover till 2024. I mean, there's a lot of sense that there's pent-up demand once we get the vaccines, that people are going to travel again and things, but you're suggesting it's going to be, why does it take years and years for you to recover?
100%. So I think there is going to be, once we kind of get back to normal, there's going to be this just influx of people that are going to want to travel, going to want to go see concerts and so forth. But there are a ton of, especially smaller venues, whether it's concert venues or museums or arts venues or restaurants, that have gone out of business or are just really, really struggling. And they might not make it to the other side of the pandemic. So there's going to be a loss of employment there. So I think as a whole, we'll probably see spending jump right back in the service sectors. We'll see spending jump back to kind of pre-pandemic levels, but I think recovery in employment is going to take some time.
And finally, just real quick, how do you see Tennessee comparing to the nation as a whole? Are we better, worse, or about the same?
Generally, we're about the same. So GDP, actually, if you look, so the quarterly data just came out. It's not in this report, but if you look at the BEA, Tennessee GDP in the second quarter, it actually contracted further. It shrunk by about 40% in the second quarter. The US GDP shrunk by about 33%. So that was a little worse. Employment, we were kind of a little better. I think, I don't remember the exact numbers, I'm sorry, but Tennessee job levels didn't contract nearly as much as employment in the nation as a whole did. So as a result, I'm thinking that employment in Tennessee, the recovery is going to be a little slower because the bounce back is going to be less than for the nation as a whole. But overall, I'd say we're pretty comparable. One thing where Tennessee lucked out is that the virus didn't hit super hard in March or in April when kind of things were just like when all of the really bad adverse effects were starting to occur. And that's, I think people were still trying to figure out kind of what to do in terms of how to keep everybody safe, what we can do from an economic standpoint and so forth. So I don't think we were hit as hard in March and April as we could have been if the virus came here instead of in the Northeast or in California.
Hey, this is Jesse Mayshark at Compass, and I was just curious. It sounds like your forecast basically assumes widespread distribution of an effective vaccine, correct? And so if that for some reason turned out not to be the case, this would probably look a lot different.
Yeah, I think, we are assuming, at least, I think we're making a pretty reasonable assumption that it's not going to happen until kind of the second half of next year. Excuse me, and there are a number of vaccine candidates that could make that a reality, between Pfizer being approved. It looks like Moderna is going to be approved soon. And there are two other vaccine candidates, I think Johnson & Johnson, I can't remember the fourth, that I think they've had pretty decent late stage results, and I think there's going to be reviews at some point early next year. So I think there's definitely a pathway for that to happen, but there are certainly going to be some distributional hurdles and logistical issues that are going to have to be figured out, which is why I don't think we're going to see kind of a full vaccination or widely distributed vaccine or vaccines until the second half of next year. But if that doesn't occur, then yeah, I think we're probably this forecast is probably too optimistic if vaccines don't pan out. So I think to add to that, I think right now there's just so much uncertainty, which makes forecasting hard, and you have to make a number of assumptions when forecasting. So we are assuming that the vaccine rollout will occur in the second half of the year, but we also have to think about kind of the trajectory of the virus and also government and consumer response to the virus. So do consumers stop spending like they did in the spring? And what does the government do? Is there more fiscal stimulus? Do states and counties start putting restrictions and close down again? I think all of those, there's just so much uncertainty at the moment, which makes us have to make some concrete assumptions to even kind of get to any sort of consensus forecast.
This is Dave Lessner again. If you got time for just a couple more, thank you. Within the state geographically, can you give any more localized data as to what metro areas are going to do the best or not, or is this strictly statewide data that you're projecting at this point?
So projections are mostly statewide, but I can say that, and if I imagine many of you have followed this too, that there has been so far kind of the trends have flipped from, we're used to seeing when we look at the economic data that the larger metro areas doing really well and having vibrant economies, and then the smaller counties are kind of lagging behind. in particular. So Nashville has really, and the counties surrounding the Nashville metro area have really been driving economic growth over the last 5 or 10 years. But the pandemic has really hurt the larger metro areas, especially ones that have denser populations or rely more heavily on the service sector and entertainment. So Nashville in particular. So we've seen that those counties have had much larger contractions and are certainly still struggling. But I think once but all of this is dictated by the virus. So at some point we will hopefully get past it. And I think we'll see really strong growth in some of the larger metro areas, especially in like Davidson County and Middle Tennessee, like we were seeing prior to the pandemic.
And in the continuing debate in Tennessee about the best tax system, so how is sales tax growth versus if we had an income tax or taxes on income versus sales? As Tennessee's revenue growth, you outlined some of the changes that have been made that have helped the growth of that. Are we more or less economically sensitive than those states relying more on an income tax?
It is hard to say. So just because it's really hard to kind of localize where what would have happened if we didn't have those legislative changes. We might have been in a totally different place. So if we didn't expand the collection of online sales tax revenues might have been pretty poor at the moment. And then, but it's really hard to say because those changes occurred at the same time as the pandemic hit. So those again were very timely legislative changes that have really helped out. Whereas from the income perspective, a lot of people have lost their jobs both in Tennessee and nationwide. So we would have seen a reduction in probably a reduction in income taxes there. So it is hard to say. One thing I will note that kind of goes back to your question also about local effects is that there has been kind of a change in who gets the local portion of the sales tax because of these legislative changes and because of the pandemic. So usually if someone goes to, like, say, a shopping center in Nashville, they purchase something, the sales tax for that purchase is going to go to the Nashville, that county in Nashville, Davidson County. Whereas now, because of the pandemic, people are staying home and they're buying more online. So now let's say people are purchasing from, say, Blount County instead, but they're buying from a store that's in Nashville, but they're just buying it online. Now those sales tax revenues are going to go to Blount County instead. So we're actually seeing pretty strong growth in sales tax revenues among smaller counties that don't have the larger supercenter shopping centers, and there's lower growth in some of the larger cities at the moment.
Finally, is there a legacy you think in terms of when we hit hard times, recessions, changes like this, businesses often find more efficient ways of doing things? Are we going to see more economic growth and employment growth coming out of this? Have companies figured out how to do more with less now and in the pandemic era? Did that shift some of the job demands for the future, either the types of jobs or the number of jobs that are necessary to sustain growth?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely been some trends that were already taking place that have just been accelerated. So telecommuting and working from home is certainly, I think, going to be more prevalent now than it was prior to the pandemic. But at the same time, productivity gains have been really strong during the pandemic as businesses have had to try to kind of figure out how to produce more goods with fewer workers. Whether it's because people are staying home because they don't want to get sick or are afraid of getting sick, or because businesses can't afford to hire as many workers at the moment. And I think, unfortunately, that's probably, from an employment standpoint, going to continue on. And that's actually one of the big reasons why we don't have manufacturing employment fully recovering even through 2030, because they're going to continue to rely on those labor-saving technologies.
Some people have speculated that states, more rural states, smaller states might gain population as people exit from New York, Chicago, Los Angeles. Is there any macroeconomic impact in Tennessee that you can see from this pandemic as a result?
So we can't see anything yet. We'll get population data for 2020 next year, but it would certainly have a positive effect on Tennessee if we have a large influx of new residents. There'd be new spending, potentially new employment, depending on the age profile of the new residents. But one piece of data that we can look at that kind of gives us an idea is the housing market, and that's been booming across much of Tennessee. It's been doing really well throughout the U.S., but Tennessee and states with kind of smaller cities, such as Knoxville, we've seen really strong growth in the housing market. Part of that's due to reduced interest rates as the Fed reduced the interest rate to near 0% to lower borrowing costs. And part of it's just people are really interested in kind of finding larger spaces, getting out of the big cities to find kind of like socially distanced housing. So that could certainly lead to a stronger recovery in states or localities that have more people coming in.
And you hinted a lot about income inequality, that upper income people were doing better than lower income people in a lot of jobs. Is there data on how has the income inequality gap widened during this pandemic, and will that last?
It's certainly, I don't have any concrete data, but it seems pretty clear that it has widened. So one website that's actually been really good it's actually called Track the Recovery. It's done by a number of economists from Harvard and I believe University of Chicago, and they have data on like weekly employment and payroll data, and so they can actually look at on a state-by-state basis to see employment levels by wage rate, by wage range. And that's where I saw the data that showed that in Tennessee, employment levels for lower income individuals is still severely depressed. And that's why I think there is some it's very important, at least for on a micro level, that UI benefits are hopefully expanded, or at least whether it's not expanded to more people, but at least expanded in terms of the number of weeks that it's provided for. I think the CARES Act, when it was put in place, they did a great job of getting a lot of money out quickly. But I think the assumption at the time was that the pandemic wouldn't have lasted as long as it currently has. And so I think there's definitely room for more stimulus and more UI benefits, especially for the people who need it. So I think that also kind of highlights the importance of better targeting. So I think rather than sending stimulus checks out to everybody or sending money out to every business, it should be targeted to the people who need it more and the businesses who need it more. But that takes a lot of planning. So it obviously, in the spring, it probably wasn't feasible when we were trying to do something very quickly.
Related to that is the Paycheck Protection Program got a lot of businesses through the tough period. As that's run out now, are we seeing a lagging effect? Are businesses failing now more? Are we still going to see the lasting impact, maybe delayed by some of the stimulus measures if they're not renewed?
Yeah, they could. We're not seeing it yet in Tennessee. So I think there was a report that came out recently that there have been throughout the pandemic about 100,000 small businesses have gone bankrupt since March. Much of that has been on the West Coast, if I remember correctly, and the Northeast. We haven't seen that as much in Tennessee yet, but it can certainly be an issue as the pandemic presses on, especially as caseloads surge. It'll really just depend on what consumers do and what the government does in terms of both state and local governments, whether there's any new restrictions or whether there's new stimulus that's renewed. I think there is some optimism at the moment on stimulus talks that there'll be renewal of the Paycheck Protection Program and UI benefits for 16 additional weeks, but just at a lower level for $300. But who knows what's going to happen with those talks. I think 2 weeks ago, everyone was very optimistic that new stimulus was going to happen. And last week, it seemed like it was done, like it wasn't going to happen. And now there's optimism again. So I think we're just going to have to wait and see how that plays out in Washington. All right. If anyone has any other questions, I'd be happy to take them. Otherwise, I really appreciate all of the questions and appreciate you all coming today.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you.